My grandparents come from Jaffna in Sri Lanka. The Malayalis come from South West India, so they're from a totally different country. Ethnically, I'm totally Jaffna Tamil from Sri Lanka, or at that time Ceylon, and quite different from the Malayalis. I have written stories, as I say, based on mostly on my childhood, because that's where I heard the most colorful dialogue. And most of my stories, I begin with dialogue. I used to, I was a little boy, so my mother and my aunts and my neighbors thought, what does a little boy know? He doesn't know anything. So they let me listen to whatever they're talking. And my stories start with dialogue, because that's what's swimming in my mind, waiting to come out in written form. And as a child, I was a very prodigious reader. I read all the time. First comics, Batman, Beano, and then I moved on to illustrated classics comics. And my mother used to sing nursery rhymes to us and later tell stories, Aesop's fables. So when I first went to primary school, I heard so many Aesop's fables, I thought he was our uncle. So when I went to school and the teacher mentioned Aesop, I said, yeah, teacher, that's my uncle. She said, how do you know? Yeah, my mother told me. He's our... So I read a lot, and then I thought, I have all this dialogue in my head. Why don't I write it down, and give back to all those people whose books I read? Why don't I give back by writing something that others can read? So two factors. One, the dialogue from my mother, and then we were in government clerks, the quarters were linked terrace houses. The walls were quite thin. You can hear your neighbors talking because the walls are so thin. So I could hear my neighbors talking, I could hear my mother talking, I could hear my aunties talking, and all this dialogue was just waiting to jump out. And then the prodigious amount of reading that I did, all that helped to influence my writing. If you look at it on the surface, one's professional life is totally different from one's writing life. Because in your professional life, you're working in an office. I was 13 years MCS, PTT officer in the Treasury Ministry of Finance, and later 13 years in Petronas. So your working life is structured, and my work was so demanding. Some nights when we clocked out in Petronas, it was already the next morning. I have written about this in an article about when Sultan Nazrin was working in Petronas, what long hours we worked. So one's working life in my case, was very demanding and structured, leaving almost no time for anything else. So one of the biggest regrets of my life is that I had so little time to spend on writing. However, it's not so straightforward, black and white, because among the 15 stories in my book, Marriage and Mutton Curry, 4 of them are based on my years in the Treasury. So it did give me material for my stories. I remember Dato Dr, the poet and writer who used to be Deputy Director General of Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka. He told me, Shan, you're one of the very few writers who's been in the civil service, in the corporate sector, so your experience is quite unique compared to others. So you should draw on your working life. And I did. As I say, I have 4 stories drawn from my days in the Treasury. And I think that's how it should be. We shouldn't be so dogmatic and have a very tight door locking. This is my working life. I used to think I have a 2-compartment life. This is my working life, this is my creative life. And when I was a child, my workaholic father said, always do your duty first. Pleasure comes later. And I thought duty is my office work. Pleasure is my writing. So I had very little time for pleasure. And my father was my role model and hero. So he was a workaholic, and the workaholic father, produced the workaholic son. So I worked all the time too. So I had so little time for writing, and when I look back, I think that's the biggest regret of my life, that even though my first love was literature, reading and writing, I didn't have much time for it. So now that I'm a consultant, I have a bit more time for creative writing. It's not easy, but I think by sheer willpower, by sheer determination, and my work took so much out of me. I tried here and there to squeeze sometimes. Sometimes I'm in the shower, I get an idea. I find that when I'm at my computer or when I'm at my desk, I'm more left brain, I'm reasoning and all that. But if I'm away from my computer, away from my desk, I'm in the shower or something, or just walking or looking out the window, then my right brain comes into effect and I can be creative and imaginative and all that, which is, I think, the highest life, the creative life. The whole creative process is very mysterious, and I have a draft memoir because I wanted my nephews and nieces. I have a nephew who works with Google in California, another niece who's in Germany. They're all over the world. And I wanted them to have an idea of the kind of life our grandparents went through. They were opening roads. My maternal grandfather was an overseer in Batu Gajah, and my mother Anna Pakim was born in Batu Gajah, and he was an overseer for PWD, building roads in Perak. And then I found that non-fiction is very restrictive, because if you say that so and so was an alcoholic, his wife, his children will not be very happy. But if you write fiction and you say Mr. A was an alcoholic, he was a murderer, anything, it's okay because it's a fictional character. So I found that writing the draft memoir, of course it helped me structure things. What happened when I was a kid before I went to school, my preschool days, so forth. It helps you structure, but it's fiction that enables me to combine 2 or 3 characters into one. So in my book, almost every character is a combination of at least 2 people that I knew or read about or heard about. So that's how the process works. But I find that once I start writing, the characters develop a life of their own, and they go to places I never intended them to go, but they want to go there, and so I'm forced to follow them with my pen or with my computer and follow them where they want to go. So it's almost like when you give birth to a child. After a while, the child will start walking on its own, and later it might cycle somewhere or drive away somewhere. So my characters are like that too. I give birth to them, but after that, they have a life of their own. And my recollection partly is historical, but the other part is the most colorful things sometimes come out first. And to me, it's the dialogue that comes to me first. I write those days by hand in foolscap lined paper. I write pages after pages. Only much later, when we had the word processor and all that, I moved to that, because the advantage is you can move para 1 to para 3 and move para 2 to para 4 and so forth. And even the word processor, the first time I learnt it was when we were writing the first economic report of the Treasury to Parliament and to the nation. At that time, last minute, different figures came and we had to change. And that's when I first learned to use the word processor. So here again is an example where my career and my profession helped my creative life. I learned to use a word processor in the office, at the Treasury. I have a little notebook and I write down. I have a pencil and notebook almost everywhere. One is beside my bed. So sometimes I get up, I dream of something, or I think of something, I jot it down in my notebook, and I have several notebooks all over the place. I think Tuanku Sultan was very generous in calling me a master storyteller. It goes back to the things I mentioned earlier. My mother reading to us Aesop's fables, singing to us nursery rhymes, me reading first comics and then moving on to classics comics, and then listening to the BBC. I remember standing tiptoe on a stool to turn on the radio as a kid and listening to serious programs on the BBC, classical music, serious lectures. A lot of it I didn't understand, but I was quite excited about learning. So I think those factors help, and in particular the dialogue that my mother and her neighbors and aunts used to talk, that helped my writing skill. Oral storytelling I had for a while in school. I used to tell stories to my classmates. But writing began in the VI, Victoria Institution in KL, when I started writing articles. We had a monthly school newspaper called the Sladang. So I wrote, and later I became the editor. So I wrote and I also edited other people's contributions. So I got into writing in the form of articles. It's only when I went to, just before I went to university, I wrote my first story that was read over Radio Malaya. It was a draft of a story called Birthday. Later I polished it and it won a prize in Oxford, the polished version of that story. So I also learned that writing is rewriting. The first draft is so far from what it ought to be. They say Ernest Hemingway, one of his books, the last page, he wrote it more than 30 times. He rewrote it one page more than 30 times. So writing is rewriting, and you keep polishing it and polishing it and polishing it, and I'm amazed, my latest draft, how much better it is from my first draft. So never rely on your first draft, whether it's a poem or a story or thing. Keep polishing. So one of the mottos I have is writing is rewriting. And then another piece of advice I had from Tan Tuan Eng, one of our most famous writers, he said, Shan, listen to your editor. So you write something and the editor says, look, you've got to totally rewrite this. This is garbage. Don't be precious about it. Say, no, I'm not going to change it. Change it. Be open-minded to criticism, to feedback. That's very important. I'd say at any time, night or day, I would take the stress of a writer compared to the stress of a corporate life. Because when you're writing, you're creating something that wasn't there. And I think that's the highest form of life, to create, the creative life from your imagination and so forth. So, sure, there's a stress in writing. Anytime, I'll take the stress of writing to the stress of corporate life, to stress of professional life. No comparison. Hands down, the creative stress wins. I was a movie critic pada zaman dahulu, very long time ago. Oh, when I was in the treasury, I used to go, you see those days, the premiere of any movie will be Saturday midnight. That's the first screening of any movie. So they screen Saturday midnight, and Radio Malaya then would get 2 passes for me, 2 free tickets to go and see the Saturday night movie. Then on Sunday, I had to write a review of the movie and give it to my producer Manaf Abdullah. There were 2 producers, Manaf Abdullah and Syed Alwi in Radio Malaya. I would send it to Manaf Abdullah. Then one of the staff of Radio Malaya would read it. And I watched a lot of international films, and I greatly admired 3 directors whom I think are the greatest film directors of the 20th century. Akira Kurosawa of Japan, Satyajit Ray of India, and Ingmar Bergman of Sweden. I think these are the 3 greatest directors of the 20th century, in my view. And then in answer to your question about local movies, in the last few years I have had no time to watch movies. I've been so busy with my work. But I saw one film which stands out. It's called Jagat. Now Jagat was produced by Sanjay Kumar Perumal, and it's a multiracial production. The role of the Chinese kingpin gangster is played by a Malay actor, and I really recommend it as a film if you want to see what urban poor is like, the urban poor are like in the 90s, you know. And the word Jagat is actually the Tamil pronunciation of the Malay word Jahat. They never say you Jahat, you Jagat, you Jagat, but actually it's Jahat. So that's how the title came about. But it's a film that I would recommend. Although it's mostly Tamil, it's a multiracial production, and it doesn't gloss over anything, and doesn't have the Bollywood song and dance routine, nothing. It's a serious film about life for the urban poor in the 90s called Lumpur. It's in the form of some bit of crime drama and all that. But at the heart of it, what's it like to be poor in the cities in Malaya in the 90s? I could never make a film on my own. So the only role I could play was being a critic. I tended to look at storytelling more in the form of writing. I love writing short stories, I love writing poems. So my creative output came via writing of short stories and poetry. Whereas with movies, my role was that of a critic because I'm not adept with the camera and so forth. So to each his own. I think in the movies, at best I can be a critic. And I was very fortunate. I was doing my doctorate in Oxford when Satyajit Ray came to Oxford, and in the history of Oxford University, they've only given 2 honorary doctorates, one to Charlie Chaplin and the other to Satyajit Ray. So I was so excited, I got the opportunity to talk to Satyajit Ray, and we got on so well that he invited me to come to Calcutta to see him shooting his movies. And I said, won't it be distracting to have somebody, standing there and ogling when you're shooting? He said, not at all. Before I shoot a movie, I've written the screenplay, I've got the music written, and I was a commercial artist before. I've sketched all the major scenes. So when I'm shooting the movie, the creative process is already done. I'm just implementing. So it's very interesting how he pre-planned everything. Nothing was left to chance. So I learned that from him. Unfortunately, I never got to Calcutta, and now he's passed away, so I lost a golden opportunity to see a maestro of movie making. Immediately after Merdeka, the British colonial officers were going to leave the country and we were doing what's called Malayanization. All the top posts were open, which were held by British colonials, were now open to Malayans. So the best graduates from all the universities, from Singapore, from Malaya, from UK, everywhere, the best graduates wanted to work for the government. Nak kerja untuk kerajaan. That was considered a patriotic duty, and it was also very stimulating because very rapidly you moved up in the top jobs in the government, in the treasury, elsewhere, because the expatriates were leaving and they were Malayanizing quickly. So at that time, I think if you say follow your passion, I think it was serve the country. We are newly independent, it needs Malayans, and let's serve the country. That was, the passion was patriotism, the passion was to serve the country. Then when the next generation came, the passion was, which job offers the highest salary? Mana yang gaji besar? Which job has the largest number of perks? Whether you get a car loan, so forth. The values change from patriotism, serve the nation, serve the people, to which job pays you best, which gives you the most material benefits to yourself. But now, the next generation, they've gone into freelance. My daughter, my son, they're all freelance. And they're more creative and they follow their passion. And yet, they're doing something creative and they're contributing. So I see an intergenerational shift from serving the country to following your passion to doing your own thing. I don't think so. I think if you plan to be rich, writing is not the way. I think it has to be a passion. It has to be something, because it's a very lonely thing. When you write, nobody's holding your hand, you're all by yourself, night and day, writing. It's a very lonely job. So if you're not passionate about it, if you have no illusions that you're going to get rich by being a writer, because The few writers who are rich are the exception. The majority live and die poor. So writing is not to make money. But on the other hand, you could say that if you follow your passion, if you love something, then it's not work. You know, I had a mechanic who told me he likes to open parts of a car and put them back. And he said, people pay me money to do that. So for him, it wasn't work, it was a passion. So for me, writing is a passion. I look forward to it. So I'm saying that it depends on your personality, on the circumstances. As I say, in the first generation after independence, served the nation. Now, if your passion happens to pay the bills, well, you're lucky. If you're not, at least you enjoy what you're doing. It's not work because it's what you love. Well, I did a lot in my work in the Treasury. There were lots of new staff that joined. I was the Deputy Secretary Economic, and among my staff was Dato Mustafa, who later became Minister of International Trade. He and his wife Kamazan were working the Treasury. I think that's where they met and fell in love and married. And they were first-class honours graduates from Melbourne in Australia. So I had young graduates working with me, and I trained them. And I was quite a demanding boss. I expected very high standards from them. Of course, at first, they weren't terribly happy, but later they said, because I was tough and I set very high standards, they also worked towards high standards. And in the long run, they liked it. And later in Petronas too, the same thing. I had bright young people and I drove them. I was a slave driver, but I drove myself the hardest. I was the first one to clock into office. I was the last to leave. So people accepted me pushing them because I pushed myself the hardest. So I did a lot of mentoring in the Treasury, in Petronas. But in writing, I feel there's so much I need to learn that how dare I teach others when there's so much I need to learn about writing. I'm still learning so much. So what I do is I do these performance readings. I read humorous and other extracts from my work, and then I have Q&A session from the audience, and then I sign books. So that's some way of imparting during the Q&A. And of course, I read lively parts from the book. That stimulates their interest in Malaysian literature. I think that you could have Kindle books, you know, things could go digital, but I don't think books will ever die because, I mean, storytelling is one of the oldest professions or pastimes of mankind. In the old days, the cavemen sat around a fire and they told stories, you know. So it's the oldest profession, and I think it's in our genes to tell stories. So whether we go digital or technological or whatever, I think storytelling has always been alive and it will still be well in the digital future. I need advice myself, but from the little that I know, I would say the first thing, read, read, read and read. You cannot be a writer if you haven't read prodigiously, just, you know, voraciously, read, read, read. I used to read everything. Everything that I could lay my hands on, I would read, read, read. And read across genres. Read novels, read short stories, read poetry, read non-fiction, read biographies, read fantasy. Read as much as you can, number one. Number two, never delay your writing. I wrote notes, but I delayed my writing because my professional work was so demanding. Because that spurt that you have, that creative idea that you have, that bulb that's shining, if you don't write it down, later you'll forget. They say Sir Walter Raleigh, when he was out hunting, he had an idea, but he didn't have his pen. So he shot a bird, broke one of its feathers, and used the quill and the blood from the bird to write. So, I mean, when you have an idea, write it down immediately, because after a while, it will fade away. Don't rely on human memory. Write it down. So I would say read, write it down, and try to read wide range of writers. Read the classics. I mean, I read Shakespeare, I read the Mahabharata, read the classics. And then we are from the third world, read the great third world writers. R.K. Narayan, D.S. Naipaul, Chinua Achebe, Boleh Soyinka, read the great. At Malaysia, we produce many writers. Muhammad Haji Saleh is a great poet both in English and Malay. Tan Sri Johan Jafar writes equally well in English and Malay. Wong Pui Nam, K.S. Maniam, Prita Samarasan. We have a large number of Tash Orr, Shirley Lim, Catherine Lim of Singapore. We have a large number of writers from Malaysia, Singapore itself. And what better sensitivity to life in our own country, in our area, than to read Malaysian Singapore writers.
Yes, you've got things covered.
Okay.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for your time.
Thank you.